Hello, and welcome to the Full of Ship podcast. Real answers to real problems. With your host, Kyle Henderson, CEO and co-founder of Vision API, a podcast dedicated to demystify the chaotic, often turbulent world of ocean freight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of Full of Ship. I'm your host, Kyle Henderson, CEO of Vision. And today I'm joined by Lars Jensen, CEO and partner of Vespucci Maritime. Good day, Lars. How you doing?
I'm great, thanks, and thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Curious, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background, but maybe to get started, how did you pick the name Vespucci Maritime for your company?
Yeah, well, when you start a company, you got to pick something. I was looking for maritime connotations and happened to be a fan of Amerigo Vespucci. I mean, he's the guy that actually discovered it was a continent. This is why America is called America. It's named after him. Columbus was just a poor sailor who got lost.
And how long ago did you start Vespucci?
I started under the different name of Sea&Tel, and that's now 11 years ago. So I've been my own master of the seas here for the past 11 years, doing great with it.
And how is the company constructed? How is it framed up? Is it a partnership between a few individuals? How have you changed over the years? Just a little bit of backstory.
No, I mean, as a bit of backstory, we were a couple of partners that started Sea Intelligence way back when, and we developed a number of tools, and Sea Intelligence is still providing those tools, regular databases on what is happening in the industry. I just figured out with myself that what I like to do the most is do new things all the time. So the element of, you can say, running a company with all that entails, that's not what really gets my blood boiling. So I've struck out then independently and tend to do what I would call all the oddball jobs out there, all this stuff where people say, I have no idea what's going on here. Can you please help me figure out what is happening? So that's been the main part of what I've been doing the last 7 to 8 years.
Understood. So it sounds like people recognize you as a leader in the space and come looking for your opinions.
At least they come looking for my opinions. Whether the opinions are then useful or not, I leave for others to judge.
Maybe could you tell us a little bit about what you did prior to Sea Intelligence / Vespucci?
Yes, I was working for about 10 years with Maersk. Most of the time there, I was the guy in charge of global intelligence and analysis. So I built up their capabilities of analyzing and understanding the container shipping market. The last few years with Maersk, I changed to a different internal role. So I was in charge of the commercial part of, back then it was called e-commerce. Today it would be the digital portfolio.
Understood. Well, 10, 11 years with Vespucci, Sea Intelligence, and more than a decade with Maersk, you have seen a few things change throughout the years. It sounds like a few sea changes, no pun intended, or maybe a pun intended there. But it seems like the hot topic nowadays, especially the last 2 years, is resiliency, agility, responsiveness. There might be some other buzzwords you would throw in there, but most of this seems to be revolving around the supply chain crisis. And there's a number of reasons I've heard people throw around for what has caused this crisis. But I'd love to know your thoughts on, what companies have truly responded well to this theme of more resilience is needed, more responsiveness is needed, agility is a value that companies should really bake into their operations.
That is a good question, and I think I will be really obnoxious and answer a somewhat different question, but down the same alley, because the way I see this, let me be maybe slightly contrarian. You say the supply chain problems, or however you phrased it. I might take the slightly contrarian view and say the supply chain does not, as such, have a structural problem. It has a tactical problem, and let me try to elaborate slightly on that. If you look at the supply chain right now, I mean, we're still moving more freight than we ever did in the history of container shipping. So from that perspective, we don't have a supply chain problem. The freight that is being moved at freight rates much, much higher than what we have been used to, which interestingly has led to, not surprisingly, carriers being more profitable than ever. So that's not a problem. ports and terminals being more profitable than ever. That's not a problem. Most freight forwarders being more profitable than ever. So that's not a problem. And then you say, well, what about the poor shippers who have to pay this? Well, if you look at some of the largest shippers in the world, they are more profitable than ever. So do we really have a supply chain problem? Well, you can certainly find metrics showing that the answer to that might even be a no. Now, of course, we do have supply chain problems. We have major bottlenecks. We have extreme delays. We have, I wouldn't even call it reliability problems anymore. We got a standard that's just unreliability. So clearly we have those problems. But this is a multifaceted issue. And when it then comes to the resilience part, have we designed the supply chains wrong so we have the problem we have now? I actually don't think so. I look at it this way. Nobody in their right mind is willing to pay for hundreds of ships and massive ports to sit idle for decades just in case. Nobody wants that. So we had a supply chain that delivered very cost efficient shipping for, let's say, the last 30 years. Does that mean that you might sometimes run into a capacity issue like right now? Absolutely yes. Does it cost us money here the last 2 years? Absolutely yes. But how many billions have this cost us in the last 2 years versus how many likely trillions have we saved over the last 30 years by not having an armada of excess ships just lying around? Uh, the supply chain issue right now, if we talk about resilience, cannot reasonably be seen on a time frame measured in just months or a couple of years. It's something that needs to be seen over decades. And container shipping, in that perspective, is the younger kid brother of the shipping industry. I mean, we came around fairly late to the game if you compare to the more mature parts, so bulkers and tankers and the like. It is not unusual, say, in the tanker industry, that every 3, 4, 5 years you have a supply chain crunch. Then suddenly freight rates go up by a factor of 20 or 30 even, and nobody bats an eyelid because everybody knows you're not going to have an armada of tankers lying around just in case. The gap between the available capacity and the capacity you use under normal circumstances is relatively low because that's efficient. And most of the time you reap that efficiency. And on a few occasions, sure, you got to pay because you don't have that buffer capacity. In container shipping, it's just the first time we reach this barrier. The slightly oddball here is because of the pandemic, it has had a longer duration than you would normally expect. And it's going to last for a while longer. But fundamentally, I don't see that part of the supply chain being broken.
I'm curious, you mentioned costs were increasing. You mentioned a few of those costs, such as freight rates going up. What are the other costs involved that have been affected in the last few years?
No, I mean, one of the issues that has been on a roller coaster has obviously been fuel prices. And there are multiple elements. Just before the pandemic struck, we had the IMO 2020 low sulfur rules coming in. And that, of course, increased fuel costs significantly. Now, in the last few months, we had the spillover effects from the Russia-Ukraine war, seeing fuel prices rapidly escalate once more. On the more interesting note on those, in the early part of 2020, due to the low sulfur fuel, it was seen by everybody as a disaster that fuel prices would suddenly go up and you would have bunker surcharges increase by maybe $100 or $200 per container. The explosion in fuel prices the last 2 months is a non-event. Sure, we're seeing bunker fuel surcharges increase as well, but on most, especially the deep sea trades, the extremely high spot rates right now means that a few $100s in bunker fuel surcharge, nobody cares because that's not the big fish to fry. This will, of course, become important a year and a half down the line when the markets normalize. But interestingly, what is usually the largest cost component, fuel, is suddenly reduced to a non-entity.
And you had made a point of setting the time frame that's appropriate for understanding the supply chain on the decades or potentially even centuries. What should be the appropriate time frame for understanding the capabilities of supply chain moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, the appropriate time frame is, again, You measure in years if you want to look at the play out here of the pandemic, but otherwise it's more like a decade that is typically a good time frame. Things change slowly, and what we perceive as large events, I tend to perceive as noise. The pandemic is noise. The financial crisis was noise. Let me try to exemplify that. When the financial crisis hit, that was, of course, a major blow to the industry. Demand tanked, freight rates tanked, and everybody was up in arms. And after the financial crisis, we struggled for years with massive overcapacity. It appears that the financial crisis was important. In reality, it was not. What was truly important was a structural shift that was already coming. We have had a couple of decades of extremely high growth, first driven by containerization itself, then by the waves of outsourcing. And that means container volumes on average for almost 30 years grew 8 to 9% per year, which is a phenomenal growth rate. And that sets an environment where the only players that thrive and survive in that environment are the ones that aggressively invest in new capacity. And that worked fine. And everybody could see that eventually this would come to an end. Eventually, we would have outsourced everything that could be outsourced. And that was way back when I was in Maersk. We built a small model in my department. And this was already about 5 years before the financial crisis. Said, well, if this is true, then we would not see continued exponential growth. This would be more like your typical S-shaped curve. And if that's the case, when does the party come to an end? And a rough ballpark pegged that to around 2010. This was around 2004 or 5, which actually turned out to be pretty accurate. Now, the financial crisis just masked this, but what in reality is the most important part was container shipping moved from being a young, high growth industry to becoming a more mature, low growth industry. But because it was so ingrained that you would massively invest in new capacity, assuming high growth, that of course means capacity overshot dramatically around 2010. And then it took the most part of a decade to absorb that to get down to what has since then been a relatively mature industry. Prior to the pandemic, we were poised for another structural shift, again, completely independent from the pandemic. The carriers have now spent those 10 years also gradually consolidating. They have realized, at least for the major backbone trades, this is a largely commoditized trade. And in order for that to become profitable, you need to have a higher degree of market concentration. Otherwise, this doesn't work out for anyone. The carriers, at least seen as an industry, has been perennially loss making for 20 years. And the way out was consolidation. And I remember actually being at the large TPM conference in Long Beach, that's about 10 years ago, where I said, look, we're going to see this. And at the time, we had slightly more than 20 global carriers, depending on how we define it. And back then, I said, look, we have to get down to 6 to 8. That's what's going to happen. And where were we just before the pandemic? We are roughly at that number. So the carriers had gotten to the point where we were heading into a structural upcycle. The order book was low. And at the same time, the carriers have now reached a level of market concentration where the normality would no longer be price wars. The normality would be higher prices and price stability. Now, the pandemic just acted as an accelerant of this, but we were going to head into a market anyway with structurally higher freight rates, more stable market conditions. So, just like the financial crisis was noise masking a transition from a young high growth industry to a more mature low growth industry, the pandemic is masking a structural transition from a fragmented market to a more consolidated market with more market power in hands of the carriers.
So, are current geopolitical happenings more noise or more signal?
They are to a significant degree more noise than signal. There's sometimes a tendency to maybe exaggerate the impact of geopolitical movements, especially on the shipping industry. Let's look at pre-pandemic when you had the trade war started by the Trump administration between China and the US. Did that impact trade between China and US? To some degree, yes, it did. Did it impact container shipping? Not really, because a lot of the goods that would then have flowed from China to US, they just came out of Vietnam or Thailand, Cambodia, From a shipping perspective, that doesn't really matter. It matters which port it then gets loaded on, but in the greater scheme of things, not really a big impact.
So is the pattern, very simply put, the growth of container shipping is a very large, slow boat, and nothing's really going to move it as long as there's consumer demand?
To a large degree, yes. You say the risk factor a lot of people have been pointing to recently, but I would say that it's something that's been pointed to the last 10 years is, are we going to see nearshoring? Are we suddenly going to see everybody move production back home? Because that would avoid some of the supply chain problems. I am not a believer that that's what's really going to happen for quite a number of reasons. The bad reason first. This is an argument I've heard almost every year for the last 10 years. There's always a reason. Now we're going to see it. It's going to be cheaper, or it's going to create local jobs, or it's better for the environment, or people want to buy local. And you can always find that one anecdotal evidence where this company has done it. But structurally, you have not seen any systematic movement towards that over the last 10 years. You just haven't. At the end of the day, it is still the finances of it that determines it. And even in the current environment, even with very high freight rates for a lot of products that are being moved, freight is still not the largest determinant. Sure, there are products for which this is highly problematic. We might get into that later. But overall, the answer to that is no. What I see much more likely to happen, and again, this was a trend that was beginning prior to the pandemic, is you will see less production in China and you would see it more dispersed to other low cost places around Asia. This was already beginning, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and those places. The current lockdown in Shanghai, in my view, is just going to serve to accelerate that even more. You're going to see, especially North American and European importers, become much more hesitant in putting all their eggs in the China basket and want to diversify it. But that doesn't change the amount of containers that gets moved. It just makes the supply chain slightly more complicated. You're going to need more feeder services in Asia.
Would it be fair to say that most players that you hear the loudest in the space today are noise creators because fundamentally they can't truly affect the economics or the market? That begs the question, who can?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't call them noisemakers. Some of there are clearly, especially on the shipper side, right, on the customer side, there are clearly some who are hurting. And to be brutally honest, there are some who will not survive this. If you look at the environment right now, it is not that every shipper is in the same boat anymore, so to speak. First of all, we need to distinguish very cleanly between head haul and back haul shippers. If I am moving high value consumer goods into the US, let's say I'm moving a container full of shoes. I have 10,000 pairs of shoes in that container. If I retail them at $100 each, that's $1 million worth of product. If I have to pay a few $1,000s more to move it, that's an annoyance, but it doesn't really change my business model. If I'm an exporter of agricultural products or, say, waste paper, I cannot afford a doubling or a tripling of rates. That simply makes my business model completely unviable. So there are clearly somebody out there who is hurting. But even if we only look at the importers, again, everybody's not in the same boat. You have an extreme split now in the pricing range. If I look at Asia Europe, when it peaked last year, you had a price differential between spot and good contract rates of $10,000 per FFE. Now, pre-pandemic, the normal level was 400. And what this means is if you are the really large importers, you get the good contract rates. If you're the small importers, you don't. So the current environment is a competitive advantage for the large importers. This drives some of the smaller guys out of business, which clearly is not good if you are the smaller guys. This is clearly a competitive advantage and is a good thing if you're the larger guys. So everybody's not in the same boat here.
Now, I understand that death throes are always noisy, but who are the players? Who are the players who actually have the influence and will nudge the trend?
That depends on what type of influence. If you look at the commercial influence, it's the extremely large importers. Those are the ones that call the shots. They fill most of the vessels on the head haul direction. And that is what drives carrier behavior. I mean, the carriers act completely rationally. Let's look at the dichotomy between importers and exporters in the US, for example. If you go by, let's say, the spot rate index, you're at a point now where about 95% of the carrier's revenue would be paid by the importer, 5% by the exporter. So that the carriers are designing their networks to focus on the importers makes complete sense. So from the commercial driver, they're the ones that call the shots. Then, of course, you have, especially in the US, a large agricultural lobby that is saying, well, this is problematic for US agricultural exports. You've seen a virtual collapse in US exports here over the last couple of years. And they are the ones that are then being the front runners on regulatory reform. Do they have some element of market power as well? Surely they do, because it does appear we are going to get a new ocean shipping reform over in the US, favoring some of the changes that the exporters would like to see. On that count, though, you can say, yes, they have market power. My view on that one is they should be careful what they wish for, because they might actually get it. One of the issues you're faced with as an exporter, and that's at least one of the claims from the exporters, is that carriers have simply flat out refused to take their cargo in favor of just sending empties back to Asia. And from a free market perspective, that makes sense. If I'm a carrier, one of the problems we had in the supply chain congestion is shortage of empty containers in Asia. So if I just ship them straight away empty, they're available faster and I can service the importers. Rational development by the carriers. What the exporters then want is put into the regulation that the carriers are basically mandated to take the cargo. If that goes in, which it actually might, the challenge is, if I look at that as a carrier and say, okay, I have to take your cargo, that's perfectly fine. But the good old days where you were getting something like a 65% discount because you're a backhaul shipper, they might not be coming back then. Then you have to pay full price like the importers. And of course, that is commercially completely unviable for the exporters. If left to its own devices, the play out I see over the coming years is head haul rates will come down. They are at the extreme levels right now, but they will never come back to pre-pandemic levels. They will consistently and sustainably be much higher than what the importers were used to. And the importers can afford it, at least most of them. Left to its own devices, backhaul rates would actually come back down to pre-pandemic levels, because the underlying dynamic governing those is not really supply and demand. It's more down to the practicalities that if I have to reposition the containers, I might as well get some revenue. That logic will come back. It's just been warped for a couple of years because of the shortage of containers. That shortage will be resolved. So from my perspective, if you look at this over, say, a 1-2 year time frame, there is no need for regulatory reform for the exporters. The problem, if you're an exporter, is you might not have 1 or 2 years. You might go bankrupt before that's up. So that's also part of what the driving force is here.
Earlier, you mentioned that the carriers are more profitable, the forwarders are more profitable, the shippers are more profitable. If rates going one direction are going to not go back to pre-pandemic, and rates going a different direction will go back to pandemic, who's paying for all that profitability?
The consumers, basically.
And then how sustainable is that? Because earlier you mentioned also that there will be an equilibrium at some point where the network will design itself to find the most efficient sourcing and transportation.
But I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. But if you look at what are the total freight payments done in the world, which of course sounds like an astronomical number in billions of dollars, but what is the value, the commercial value of the goods being moved? Here we are talking trillions and trillions. So the increase in freight payment seen relative to the overall value of trade is still exceedingly small. The trick here is, for some commodities, freight rates basically don't matter at all. Freight is still extremely cheap. But for some commodities, this goes for very, very low value commodities and for very bulky commodities. Freight is extremely important. And this is where we then get into the whole discussion around inflation. It's been said across the board that, well, higher freight rates leads to inflation. Yes and no. There are clearly some elements where that would be the case. A practical example, say you're importing cheap refrigerators. I mean, you cannot put that many refrigerators into a container. And if the freight rate suddenly triples, yeah, that's going to lead to an increased price on the fridges because of the cost increase. Absolutely. But then coming back to the example about the shoes, it almost doesn't matter at all. There you have a completely different inflation. Think back to the end of 2021. The headlines leading up to the Christmas season was filled with, oh my God, we got all these supply chain issues. So the goods might not be there. We might have empty shelves. Now, can you recall that we had completely empty shelves? Nobody can, right? But there were all these TV images showing empty shelves, because if you go to a supermarket, you can always find that one empty shelf out of 10,000. That also means that for companies that were selling goods that were not really in short supply, where the freight cost actually does not matter, they were able to sell more product at normal price rather than put them on sale, because the consumers were afraid that goods would run out and they would buy them before they came on sale. Secondly, of course, if you are a retailer, there is this narrative very successful out there right now that the supply chain is in chaos, which is true. Freight rates have gone up, which is true. And this is why my retail goods now are taking a price hike. Well, yeah, your retail goods are taking a price hike, but those might be some of the goods where the cost actually doesn't matter all that much, but the consumer is now willing to pay more because of the narrative around the supply chain. So you've got two very different drivers of inflation. One is the pass through of cost, which is true for some types of goods. But the other one, that is more because the consumers now have a willingness to pay more because they believe erroneously that the impact of the supply chain is larger than it actually is.
Any intelligence on the distribution of those two types of goods? Ones that there is pass-through cost and others that don't really have a pass-through cost?
Not that I have seen so far, and not that I have done quantitatively, at least not yet. That's part of the challenge, right?
Is another way of getting at that answer understanding what's the ratio been in freight cost increase versus cargo value increase? Has it been one for one, or has it been not one for one?
No, it has not been one for one, because again, it depends more on whether you're big and small. If we had to make it very simple, if I'm shipping 100,000 TEU, I've been able to weather 2021 pretty well at good contract rates. If I'm moving a few hundred TEU, I've been subject to the vagaries of the spot market, where rates that used to be, say, 2,000 spike about $20,000 per TEU. That's completely irrespective of which goods I'm moving. It has led to some importers, like, for example, toy importers, changing their product portfolio to favor smaller toys rather than larger toys. So you can say the value density becomes higher inside the container, so you can better absorb the higher costs. Is this
So
going to have, in terms of who then hurts? You have importers, both in Europe and North America, that for decades have had a business model where you are producing extremely cheap goods, predominantly in China, and you're also then selling them at extremely low prices in North America and in Europe. I would not be sure that that business model survives in the future, because that is contingent on two elements being there at the same time. It relies on extremely low transportation costs, which is what we've had for decades. And it also relies on extremely low labor costs. Both of these have to be there. Going forward, you're still going to have the low labor costs, but the supply
somewhere.
chain costs, the supply chain costs are going to be higher. I'm not going to say they will be high, because relative to many commodities, they'll still be low. But for the particular business model where you rely on extremely cheap rates, those business models might simply not be around in the future.
Would it be fair to say that in these market crises situations, it typically benefits the bigger players and it eliminates the count of smaller players? Whether that's
Uh,
forwarders,
I,
shippers,
yeah,
cargo
yeah,
owners.
yeah. To some degree, yes. I mean, clearly, if you are huge right now, you definitely do have an advantage. I would rather say it disfavors, let's call them the medium sized players, the ones that do not have the strength and scale to get the good deals with the carriers, yet are so large that they're not really all that nimble. If you are extremely small, you might be more nimble in terms of saying, okay, fine, then I'm going to move my production to country A, B, or C because it's not that big a deal. It's not that much I have to move. So if you're very small, you tend to be more nimble. So it's more the medium sized players that might have a challenge here.
So, what are you anticipating will be the back pressure on that trend? Is it a consolidation of those medium players? Will they band together? Will they get bought by the bigger players? How does
Yeah.
it play out?
Yeah, I mean, the play out for those ones is some of them are going to go bankrupt and some of them are going to be acquired by the larger players. And of course, they're not all going to disappear. There'll still be some, but ultimately it will lead to more of a consolidation process on the part, in this case, say retailers or the importers. And you can say that's also been part of, if you look at some of the political pressure that has been levied, and say, well, we need regulatory reform because this is, say, unfair towards some of the importers. My perspective on that is, well, part of the reason why it has been this way the last couple of years is we got a shortage of supply. There's just not enough space for everybody. Simple as that. So somebody has to be left behind. So we need to prioritize. What's the mechanism for prioritizing? Last 2 years, the mechanism has been very simple. It's been free market dynamics. Who wants to pay the most? Of course, then augmented slightly by how much volume do you bring to the table. If you want to go down the path of saying we need to protect, say, the smaller guys, okay, that's a political choice. That's a different mechanism of priority. It doesn't change the fact that somebody still needs to be left behind. It's going to be somebody else. So the choice is basically what is the mechanism for priority? Is it supply and demand, free market pricing, or is it political intervention? That's basically where the discussion stands.
What is visibility in context of supply chain, and what influence has it had on these trends in the last few decades?
That's also a longer story. I mean, visibility, I mean, right up until before the pandemic, there was a long, strong drive around we need visibility. There was this, I would almost call it myth that all the shippers wanted visibility. That's true. I mean, if you asked all the shippers, they clearly wanted visibility. My experience was also in many cases they didn't really know what to use it for. I saw that as a symptom of something else. Saw it as a symptom that a lot of the shippers felt that they were being very poorly informed by typically the carriers or by proxy the freight forwarders. So that when something no longer went according to plan, they only discover that in the last possible second. So when you don't have a confidence that your supplier is going to tell you when something's going to go off track, you want to monitor it yourself. So it was not really because they wanted that visibility, it was because they didn't trust their suppliers to tell them. Now, the next problem with that is, and again, this was pre pandemic, I saw a lot of shippers not really realizing that, sure, you can get visibility. You can hook yourself up to AIS trackers so you can see where the ship is. Okay, fine. The ship is in the Indian Ocean. It's now 36 hours late. What does that mean when it comes to Rotterdam? Well, that's where the predictive algorithms come in. And they were only beginning to reach a point pre pandemic where you could begin to assign at least some level of credibility into them, because visibility is not really interesting in terms of seeing where things are right now. Visibility only becomes interesting when you combine it with the ability to predict and what does this mean down the line to allow you to take corrective action to prevent problems. And we are only in the early phases of that.
What's the time horizon on how you use the phrase predict? Are you referring to using collected visibility information in better planning or better execution?
Yeah, it's all of the above. And you can say, at least my favorite, let's say, hypothetical example is could we have avoided a lot of the bottleneck problems we're seeing right now? Fully, no, but to a significant degree, yes. Think it through this way. If, let's say, a US importer places a purchasing order with, let's call it a factory of stuffed kangaroos in Alice Springs in Australia, then they place the purchase order there. Then it might be a month until that is produced. Then it has to be trucked out to Brisbane. Then it has to be shipped. From the point where this purchase order is being placed until that cargo physically needs, say, a truck in California, you have a lead time of maybe 3 or 4 months. And you can extend that argument. So let's say hypothetically, if you could gather all purchase orders around the world, match that up with what is the available capacity of trucks, of rail, of ports, of terminals, ships, and everything else. You can actually predict 3, 4, 5 months out with relatively high degree of certainty. Are we going to get a congestion problem in any given location if you had all that data? Would that necessarily lead to you being able to prevent all congestion problems? Not necessarily. You might have more purchase orders placed than physically the system can handle, but you can smooth out the spikes. You can redirect cargo. You might say, okay, fine, I'm actually going to get my cargo 2 or 3 weeks later, or I might want to move it up and get it 1 or 2 weeks early to smooth out all of this. There is not in the world today the capability to do this. To some degree, because not all of the data really exist yet, but also to some degree because a lot of the parties that have the information, they don't share it. A lot of the reason is they don't have the internal systems allowing them to share it to start with, and for a lot of them, they don't want to share it. They see it as highly confidential, competitive information. If we are to think, say, 10, 15 years down the line, I think that's actually where we're going to get to. But it's going to take time. It's going to take time because you need all the players out there to go through a maturitization process where they become more willing to share the data. To some degree, I think they're going to be forced down that path. I think especially IoT devices on containers is going to drive a lot of that.
Curious, from where we stand today, and if we got to look out 10 to 15 years in the future, how different will planning and execution look compared to one another? Or will it be some kind of hybrid or something completely different?
No, I mean, where we're going to get to with all of this is we're going to get to a point where, and this is where I still see a lot of players in the industry mistake what is happening. They look at it and say, okay, we need to automate. And automate, I mean, by automate, I don't necessarily mean robots in the ports, but automation of the movement of information. We need to automate because that makes us more competitive. I think that's plain wrong. You need to automate because if you don't, you're going to be at such a high cost disadvantage that you're just going to go bankrupt. You're going to go out of the game. But because everybody's moving down this path, that also means the automation becomes table stakes. You just got to have it. The way I see it is, if I want to move freight, doesn't matter almost how complex it is. If it goes according to plan, nobody touches it. It's all automated. It's all run by computers. That's it. But the key then is what happens when things no longer go according to plan. That's where you come more down to the execution part. This is where the competitive advantage comes in. The competitive advantage comes in because this will favor companies that A, have the better routines to predict when things are going to go off the rails even before they do, so they can take corrective action earlier on. And the ones that then have basically the best people on the ground say, okay, fine, things no longer go according to plan. We have a bridge here that's washed out. What can we do quickly right now to help our customers? That's where customer service comes in. So the notion I still see from some companies that we need to automate because that means we become competitive is completely untrue. You need to automate to stay in the game. And then you got to focus on, and what do we do when things do not follow according to plan? Now, I make it sound like you can then only differentiate yourself when things go wrong. But the exceptions are, of course, also when you have somebody that needs a very specific type of freight that just doesn't fit the normal mold. That goes into the same bucket. So it's the exception handling that becomes the core of profitability.
So it sounds like we're having an assumption that, and maybe just for this conversation, the predictability aspect for everything that goes according to plan should be at a very high level at some point in the future for the players still in the space.
Yes.
But it seems like what you're saying is the crux will be who has better kind of live monitoring of the health of the network to see exceptional, let's say, not exceptions to a specific shipment, but exceptions to the network sooner than others. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could say it becomes a competitive advantage to have the better predictive algorithms. Let's put it that way. Uh, One of the challenges right now is if you look at it from, say, a container
Sorry,
shipping
quick
perspective.
question there. When you said better predictive algorithms, do you mean better at taking live information and integrating them into the algorithms and updating the algorithms, or just better based upon the historical information?
No, no,
Which is
taking live information in. You have to take in the live information, otherwise you won't be able to then spot the signals that now something is going to go off the rails. And you can say the challenge here is everybody to some degree rely on the same fundamental infrastructure. We use the same ports and terminals. We use the same roads. Then, of course, the different players can have their commercial fights over who gets preferential action. That's all part of competition. But the physical level here, we're still using the same choke points. So everybody having access to more or less that same information, then competing on the ability to use that information is where we're going to go to.
understood. And who do you see that doing that well today?
On the carrier side, I'm still not really seeing anybody do that well. They are warming up to do it. Some are, of course, much further ahead on the digital journey than others. If you look purely at the container carriers themselves, I would say carriers such as Hapag-Lloyd or Maersk are probably some of the ones that are the furthest down the path. But are they at the point that we talked about now? Absolutely not. No, they're not. That's still quite a way to go. And you can say there's a reason why there are now different companies out there that are providing, for example, predictive ETAs. They will look at AIS data on ships and predict when is the ship going to be in port. And those predictive algorithms turn out to be more accurate than the raw data coming from the carriers that actually operate the ships, which in a rational world should not be possible. The carriers should definitely have the best info, but at least that's not where we are right now.
And I'm curious, what does that better prediction on the vessel arrival really do at the end of the day? Like, how does that fit back into your model of understanding it 3 or 4 months out, and that being actually the
I mean,
meaningful impact?
here we'll not say 3 or 4 months out, but if I'm able to tell you, well, the ship you think is going to arrive in 9 days is more likely to arrive in 14 days. That has practical ramifications because as an importer, I would like to know that as early as possible. I might not like to know it's 5 days delay, but it allows me to say, fine, I'm going to reschedule my trucker. I might want to reschedule the use of my warehouse for something else for those days. There's a lot of other actions I can then take as an importer to optimize my own processes. The more accurately I know that something is not going to go according to plan, that allows me to also take alternate actions to mitigate the impact.
So, how should we think about visibility and prediction from the perspective of its use at getting advantage in the noisy side of the industry versus the longer term trend of the industry?
Yeah, we need to separate to a large degree between those two because one thing is what we talked about here. These are the tactical things. They will always be there. In the longer terms, that is more about creating some of that resilience. Because we come back to what we talked about earlier. Nobody is going to want to pay for having, say, 1,000 ships sitting idle just in case. So the only way we can have a reasonable resilience in the industry is to be able to predict, say, 3, 4, 5 months down the line, are we going to have major choke points and then reassess where do we ship the cargo to avoid some of those choke points. That's where part of the longer term resilience comes in. Because I know right now there is a lot of shippers that say, sure, we would be willing to pay more for resilience. And absolutely they are today. They are paying more for resilience. But think 2 years into the future. Let's say all this mess is cleaned up and we are back to more or less the operations we were used to. If I'm then the importer saying, well, for resilience purposes, I actually keep a longer supply chain and larger inventories because I learned my lesson. Okay, cool. Let's say I'm importing t-shirts and I'm doing that. Rest assured, at that point in time, somebody will look at my business and say, what a fool, his supply chain is much too inefficient. I'm going to launch a competing t shirt import business with a much more lean supply chain. So, no, and in the long term, nobody will be willing to pay for resilience when it comes as physical inventory or physical excess capacity. So, the only way we can create more resilience is to be able to better predict some of these choke points and then smooth out the flows.
So curious, is resilience the proper term to use, or is it more the ability to maintain tactical leverage by being in the early adopter front half of the visibility curve? Because what I'm hearing you're saying is the companies that can be more agile in maintaining a tactical dominance in the noisy portion, the shorter term portion of the market, will be able to find those advantages. But there should be a certain amount of investment in that. And then there should be a separate certain amount of investment in kind of your longer term infrastructure resilience. Like trying to, I feel like these two different threads get conflated quite often, especially on the shipper cargo owner side when they're trying to think long term and short term in the same breath. How
That's true. I mean, and again, the short term, you are down to the tactical part. The longer term, where it becomes more important for the shippers, is more from the perspective of saying that also goes back to what we talked about before. That part of your resilience would then come from not necessarily sourcing from one large location, but spreading that one out, understanding what are the flows, what are your risks involved with it. Let's take a very, very practical example. If you have placed all your production in Shanghai, you have a problem now. That's nothing to do with the ships. It's everything to do with the location in itself, right? So part of the resilience discussion or robustness in the supply chain has to extend to the manufacturing location itself.
So are we just getting back to the old age maxim that knowledge is power at the end of the day?
Well, that has always been the case for the last, what, 3, 4, 5,000 years. But it also but part of that maxim is also that you are assuming everybody has access to raw information. The onus is who is better able to then use that information to
Yeah,
analyze it and come up with actions on the basis of it.
Yeah, because some are better at acquiring it, some are better at utilizing it, some are better at forgetting it. Oh, very interesting conversation so far. I think to start wrapping ourselves up a bit here, I'd like to maybe understand a little bit about the buzz fatigue. If you were to give some advice on stop thinking about this problem, stop thinking about this offering, stop thinking about X, Y, and Z because it's not beneficial to you, what would you advise the cargo owners, the forwarders, the carriers? What's the noise that has no real advantage to pay attention to?
That is a good question, because you got a lot of noise right now that longer term is not important. Like we talked about, I will be contrarian and say long term the pandemic is not important in itself, but obviously it is extremely important right now. The mental
And
picture.
important to know that things like that will happen.
It will happen, yes, and it will happen again at some point in time. Not necessarily a pandemic, but a supply chain crunch. It will happen again. It's inevitable in the way the industry works. So the challenge. I'm not sure whether it's bus, but I would rather look at it this way. The problem is, think about yourself standing with your feet in a. You're standing in a burning building. Your only objective will be, how on earth do I get out of the building and put out the fire? But are you willing to take a discussion on how do you use better flame retardant materials to avoid a fire in the future? That's a very relevant discussion, but you're not really in a mood to discuss that while you're actually in that burning building, right? The problem in the industry right now is we need to do both. We need to both deal with the fire, but we also need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's why I see the problem is finding enough companies that are devoting enough resources to also thinking about the future. And you can understand why when you are in the burning building. But the problem is, the moment we're out of the burning building, people tend to forget, and then we get another burning building 5, 10 years down the line.
That another classic maxim of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yeah, exactly. No, you can see that time and time again. Let's take an example. Back in 2017, when Maersk was brought to its knees by a cyber attack, for example, I was involved quite a bit in also maritime cybersecurity at that point in time. Had been in the years leading up to it, and we had been saying for years that this was inevitable. It's going to happen, and nobody really took that threat seriously. Then Musk got hit, and you would think that would change the game. And for the first few months, it did. And when a year or so had gone by, you basically got to the point where most companies say, yeah, sure, it happened to Musk, but we are safe, kind of thing. It seems that these calamities are only really top of agenda while they are right in front of us. And then we tend to forget it. And that's why I would like to see the industry become much more forward thinking, and also think about, to stay in the mental picture of, the flame retardant materials we need. And that's why I think, I mean, whether it will be successful or not remains to be seen, but initiatives such as Flow over in the US, where it really is a matter of saying, how can we better share a lot of this data, is some of the right building blocks we need. Setting standards like DCSA is doing is part of the right building blocks. You can, of course, always say, DCSA should have happened 30 years ago. Why didn't we do it back then? But that's water under the bridge. At least they're getting there now. And this is where I see very good work done on setting the standards. But I'm seeing very slow movement on behalf of the carriers to actually implement those standards, because, well, they're busy with in their minds, it's partly the burning building because their ships' schedules are all over the place, but they're also dealing with the issue, well, if I can make $10 billion by allocating all my resources to that, maybe that's what I want to do.
Well, neither Flow nor DCSA are something a shipper, a forwarder, a carrier can buy right now. What are your short-term suggestions what are your suggestions, practical suggestions for smart places to invest for both short-term benefit and long-term benefit to these players in the space?
No, I see. I'm not sure I would point to any specific companies or products, but what I do tend to point to also with some of my clients, especially if you're talking shippers or small to mid-size shipping lines, is look for tools that don't necessarily do much more than what you're capable of today, but are actually digitizing you. Make sure you get your core data in order, make sure your processes flow. When that is in order, then you can also start to look for other tools that can help, for example, in these predictive capabilities that we talked about. But don't go for the fancy predictive capabilities before you have your own house in order in terms of your own data, because then you're simply building on quicksand.
Well, thank you for the time today, Lars. Any last comments, suggestions, advice, or inspirational thoughts you leave us with?
No, I'll just leave it where we basically started when we started this whole conversation. I don't think that the supply chain is broken. It's under stress, absolutely yes, but we are moving more freight than we ever did in human history. It's just going a little bit slower. So the supply chain is enormously robust. The supply chain has survived for thousands of years because it is extremely resilient and extremely robust. Does that mean that all customers of the supply chain are happy? Absolutely not. Does it mean that all customers of the supply chain will survive? No, it doesn't. As we also talked about, there will be some who do not have a viable business model going forward. But in the larger scheme of things, this is an extremely resilient industry.
So as long as civilization proceeds, trade will continue.
Exactly.
Well, thank you again for being a guest here on Full of Ship. I'd like to also thank our listeners for enjoying and taking time to think about these topics as well. And again, thank you for really weighing in on, I think, a number of topics that are not always considered as much, especially in such a noisy world that we're in today. So again, thank you for your time. And this is another episode of Full of Ship. Our guest, Lars Jensen, CEO and partner of Vespucci. Help me remember, Vespucci Maritime, right? That's right. You picked the name because it had to do with Amerigo. And being the first person to really say, hey, no, that is a whole new continent over there. So Lars, thank you for your time. And until next time, this is Full of Ship.
Thank you for joining Kyle and his guest on the Full of Ship podcast. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time as Kyle continues to demystify ocean carrier tracking with his future guests.